From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. Reform begins its party conference today after a summer in which it's been gaining momentum, leading the polls and setting the political weather.
Today we launch Operation Restoring Justice.
I saw a Prime Minister in waiting. I saw somebody prepared to take on the mainstream media and the left.
TikTok has 1.3 million followers now. Gen Z want to vote reform.
You know, I come from the land of Magna Carta. I come from the land that gave us the mother of parliaments, and it doesn't give me any great joy to be sitting in America and describing the really awful authoritarian situation that we have now sunk into.
It hasn't all been plain sailing. While Nigel Farage went to Washington hoping for a spotlight on the global stage, Elon Musk went on X to describe the leader of reform as weak, runny sauce and encouraging his followers not to vote for him. Despite that blip, Nigel Farage still sees himself as the next Prime Minister.
And I'd remind Keir Starmer, I got rid of David Cameron, I got rid of Mrs May. If you go on being rude to me, I'll get rid of you.
But if reform is preparing to be the next government, what would that actually look like? For a hint, we've turned to the councils where the party is already in charge.
There has been something of an exodus of Reform UK councillors.
There's some concern also about some of the age of the individuals that have been given cabinet posts on councils.
It's not my fault that I'm 19.
Too young, no experience, big budget to deal with.
A budget of £500 million.
So is this a party that's ready for power? The story today: reform, the realities. Would you mind just starting by introducing yourself?
My name is Aubrey Allegretti and I'm the Chief Political Correspondent for The Times.
And Aubrey, as we speak, you are preparing to head up to the Reform Party conference in Birmingham, which takes place on Friday and Saturday. How is preparation going?
Throughout the summer, I've been following Nigel Farage. He's been doing these weekly press conferences, which has completely led the news agenda. He's managed to keep migration the sort of main narrative pushing through summer. So I and the Reform media staff and indeed some of the MPs have gotten to know each other very well. It's going to be slightly strange to be going from Reform HQ, where most of these press conferences have been held in a sort of small room, to a huge hall with more than sort of 10,000 delegates there as well.
Not only have they managed to hold the narrative over summer with constant sort of press conferences, big campaign moments, they also seem to be doing really well in the polls. But in order to understand whether they could actually win an election and whether they could govern, I suppose we should really look at the places where they're already having a chance. And that is in some of the councils that they hold. So just talk us through what we've seen so far.
Reform really got its first taste of power during the local election results in May. It was catapulted to controlling 10 councils, and it's the largest party on a handful of others. It's also got 2 metro mayoralties now. And I suppose this is fight or flight time for Reform. They've been criticised for being a party which very much operates best on the attack, trying to sow disharmony and criticise those in power. Now it's facing scrutiny over the first few months of its record. And it's been a bit of a mixed picture. So there have been a lot of hitches in the road for these Reform councils. They're finding that actually this is a lot more difficult than it looked on the outside.
Well, let's talk about some of the policies that have got them into those difficulties, starting with their plan to try and cut costs in local councils and to save money. I mean, they talked about this a lot. They said they wanted to be like Doge in America. How has that gone for Reform?
So Doge is named after Elon Musk's venture, the Department of Government Efficiency in the US. It effectively wants to take a sledgehammer to council spending and replicate some of what Musk has done at the US national level in town halls across the UK. They came in on this grand sweeping promise to cut council waste.
I've looked at the numbers. We probably need a Doge for every single county council in England. I mean, quite why Lancashire County Council spent £500,000 on ergonomic chairs for their staff, I don't know.
And I think very quickly realised that that wasn't possible on a meaningful scale. Undoubtedly, there is waste in councils, spending which Reform disagrees with and which some voters might disagree with. There is duplication of work. But in the grand scheme of things, councils have to deliver what they are statutorily required to, i.e. what the law tells them to. This is not councils making decisions about what they do or don't spend money on. And so Reform has faced a lot of difficulties probably in coming in, realising that there isn't a lot of fat to cut, and kind of shouting and pointing quite loudly at, what they would describe as frivolous spending. They say that asylum seekers are being taken on bowling trips to the cinema, to clothes shops and things like that. But in the grand scheme of multi-million-pound council budgets and 14 years of cutbacks to local authorities, they're finding that actually this is a lot more difficult than it looked on the outside. So, for example, in Nottinghamshire, Reform came in and said they were going to conduct this efficiency review. The council basically blocked increases for councillors' allowances to save £112,000 a year. But again, that's incredibly sort of small fry in the grand scheme of things.
That's from a budget of millions.
And again, when you look at Northamptonshire, there's another efficiency review been ordered, but the council was only formed in 2021 when Northamptonshire County Council went bust. So budgets are already tight. In Kent, the council's recent budget consultation for the following financial year found that because of the cost of delivering services, there'll still be a funding gap of £50 million. And that's even if council taxes are raised to the maximum allowed. So I think they're finding that they can make some piecemeal moves to cut costs, but are overall struggling to do things which will meaningfully put council finances on a safer footing.
So saving a few 100,000 here or there isn't going to make much of a difference. It is, I suppose, in some ways, rather like the government is finding on a national level, actually a really difficult economic climate to meet the promises you make. What does Reform say about their success or perhaps lack of it at the council level?
Again, Reform is trying to use national issues, particularly ones through a social lens, to keep banging the drum for what it wants to do. And those have included things like trying to divest in climate change schemes and plans to pursue net zero. I mean, nationally, Reform already claims to have saved £40 million from scrapping net zero policies in local government. But Reform overall is still facing a big black hole in its council finances. Taken together, Reform's councils have a combined budget deficit by March next year of £489 million.
Clearly, question marks over both the policies and how effective they are, but also how they'll be able to implement them. I suppose there's also a question mark over people. A lot of Reform's politicians who've come in just as Reform don't have the experience, and that seems to be a problem. I mean, just tell us about some of the issues they've had with people.
Maybe we should start with Nigel Farage's assessment of this, actually. At one of his press conferences over the summer, he gave the analysis that the councils that had performed best were being run by those who'd come across from the Conservatives, effectively people who defected and had lots of experience running councils.
Yes.
Contrast that with somebody like George Finch, who is the 19-year-old leader of Warwickshire Council. There was a man called Rob Howard. He was the council leader, but quit after just 41 days, citing health reasons. He handed over control to George Finch. He took over at the tender age of 18. He's turned 19 since.
I was elected by the people. They wanted young, fresh, innovative change. In life experience, like, oh, have you run a business? No, but I've bought from a business. I've done everything that everyone's done. It's not my fault that I'm 19.
Again, making no comment on his skills and ability in that role, but he clearly does not have decades of experience running a multi-million-pound local authority. In Staffordshire, you also had Wayne Titley, who's a new councillor for the Nossal and Eccleshall ward. He resigned after criticism over a Facebook post in which he called for the Navy to intercept small boat crossings in the Channel using a volley of gunfire aimed at sinking them. And in Leicestershire, Reform's leadership there descended into chaos after Joseph Boehm, the 22-year-old deputy leader, left his post after a clash with the leader, Dan Harrison. And fourthly, in Nottinghamshire, Desmond Clark, the councillor for Newark West, resigned over changes to his personal circumstances.
Aubrey, we've been talking about the problems reform has had at local council level. With that in mind, let's talk about conduct and language. If they are hoping to form a government, that will matter. So how are they doing on that front?
Reform is explosive, bombastic. It knows how to grab headlines and be incendiary. And Farage has been specifically warning of mass-scale civil unrest.
The mood in the country around this issue is a mix between total despair and rising anger. In fact, I think there is now, as a result of this, a genuine threat to public order.
I should stress that he says he hopes that doesn't happen, but he's certainly been fomenting a lot of the anger. He's encouraged people to go out and protest outside migrant hotels.
Whose side are you on? Are you on the side of women and children being safe on our streets? Or are you on the side of outdated international treaties backed up by a series of dubious courts?
There are critics in the Labour Party who will say that he has been responsible for whipping up some of the more inflammatory elements of the protests we've seen this summer. I mean, it is opposition parties' job to make provocative criticisms and comments about the governments. Labour did it in opposition as well. But we have heard even more escalating language from people like Zia Youssef, the former chair who's now running Doge. He has described young migrants as fighting-age males.
Tens of thousands of fighting-age males, as Nigel said, have arrived on our beaches. In fact, the total number of illegal immigrants in the country now stands at least 1 million. There's little doubt that the United Kingdom is being invaded.
Reform is unabashed about using language like invasion. I mean, I recall David Cameron being criticised for discussing migrants and talking about there being a swarm of people coming to the UK.
I accept that because you've got a swarm of people coming across the Mediterranean, seeking a better life, wanting to come to Britain because Britain...
It seems like we've moved well past that point of very controversial language just less than 10 years ago.
And it's not just the language. Reform does seem to have consistent issues with its communications policy. I mean, we've recently had high-profile policy launches, followed almost immediately by U-turns, confusion, contradictory interviews. What's going on there?
Nigel Farage and Reform have faced challenges trying to come up with national policies. We heard from Farage and Youssef about Reform's plans for the mass deportation of small boat arrivals. They were asked at a press conference that I was at in Oxford whether that extended to women and children.
You've said that you're going to detain anyone who arrives via small boats. Will that apply to women and girls? And what about unaccompanied children?
Yes, women and children, everybody on arrival will be detained, and I've accepted already.
Farage said yes, but then the following day reversed his position.
I was very, very clear yesterday in what I said, that the deportation of illegal immigrants, we were not even discussing women and children at this stage. There were so many illegal males in Britain, and the news reports that said that after my conference yesterday were wrong. Wrong, wrong, wrong.
And then you turned again, so an O-turn, if you like.
Yeah, an O-turn, because he seemed to blame the journalists who were there and reported literally what he said, and then reversed again so that he ended up back where he began. That does sort of hint at a problem with communications in the party, because, you know, while he was doing half of that, reversing on what he'd said the day before, he had very senior figures like Richard Tice out doing interviews saying the opposite. It does start to look like there isn't a particularly coherent communications message.
The deportation policy was in the works for weeks, but I think it is interesting how much there is a very small group of people who are in charge of this thing. Basically a WhatsApp group which contains Nigel Farage, Zia Youssef and the MPs, and they are often deciding things at breakneck speed. Sometimes that means that there are holes in the policies. They do have a policy team. They do have a big coterie now of staff. They've got a really impressive office in Millbank Tower with a reform-linked think tank, the Centre for a Better Britain, a few floors beneath them. So there is certainly starting to be a bigger infrastructure in terms of how reform operates. But the big calls are made quickly by Nigel Farage and Zia Youssef and some of those around them. And that means that there is the potential for some of these communications issues to creep in.
It's really interesting to sort of hear how they're doing it with, via WhatsApp groups. It's not just that the communications aren't necessarily coherent. It does feel like the policies just keep changing too. As you say, they changed their minds on women and children several times. They also seem to change their minds on Afghan interpreters when that didn't go down very well. And they seem to have got themselves into a position now where they've announced that they will end up negotiating, doing deals, possibly paying the Taliban in order to take people. I mean, how is that going down?
Probably the biggest announcement we've heard from Reform in the last few months was this plan for mass deportations.
Today we announced the Reform government will introduce a UK deportation command to deport every illegal migrant in the country.
It was unveiled by Nigel Farage and Zia Youssef at the end of August. The culmination, really, of their campaign, which claimed that Britain is lawless.
With more arriving every day, this is a national security emergency. As Prime Minister, Nigel Farage will pass the Illegal Migration Mass Deportation Act to ensure no activist judge can stop people.
And they were laying out plans to deport and detain 600,000 illegal migrants over 5 years. Zia Youssef himself called this Trump Mark II, but Farage faced questions from journalists over whether or not he was willing to potentially do some deals with some quite questionable countries with difficult human rights regimes. We think of the Taliban, which has taken power in Afghanistan after 2021, and Farage was saying that he would set aside effectively a budget to pay some of these countries to take back their citizens who had emigrated from them.
What financial incentives are you suggesting you offer them to take deportees back?
Can I be clear that no young man from Iran who arrives by boat should be walking the streets of our country? Under no circumstances.
Even if that meant sending people back to potential torture or death in places like Afghanistan, Iran, Eritrea. And he's also obviously talked about the UK being removed from the European Convention on Human Rights and the UN Conventions on Refugees and Torture.
And in terms of communications, one of the things that they've really lent into, following on from J.D. Vance and Elon Musk in America, very much Trump's line too, is freedom of speech. And yet they seem to be having problems with that too when it comes up close.
Nobody could accuse Nigel Farage of not taking very many journalists' questions at press conferences. In fact, they sometimes drag on a little bit too long. I'm looking at my watch, hoping that they'll wrap up. And he normally does give quite lengthy and detailed answers. But at a local level, there have been some difficulties. Nottinghamshire County Council, which has a Reform UK party in charge, has imposed an unprecedented ban, really, on dealing with its local newspaper. The Nottingham Post was told that its journalists will no longer be able to interview any Reform councillors, including the council leader, and council officials have been ordered not to send press releases to the Post or invite its reporters to events unless they involve public emergencies like flooding or fire.
That's sort of beyond, free speech on social media. Local press are vital in holding local government to account, and they don't seem to be keen to engage with that.
Absolutely. It was apparently a reaction to coverage of the new administration.
They asked me for opinions, and they weren't putting out what I said. They were spinning what I said, cutting it in half, making it try to say something different.
Including reports of apparent dissent within the Reform ranks over plans for council reorganisation, and a video interview with a cabinet member who seemed to have a pretty loose grasp of the policy brief.
How do you see the relationship with Emka moving forward? Take a minute if you need.
Sorry. I don't know what to say to that.
Are you aware of if it's currently a good relationship? How is it going to go moving forward?
I have no idea, genuinely. So I have no idea.
it is ultimately a difficult position for Reform to take, to say that it is very pro-freedom of speech on the one hand, with Nigel Farage in the US to very strongly make that point, and then its councillors taking a different approach in this instance.
How have they explained it? What's the party's line on it?
Reform has effectively dead-batted these questions nationally. They've said that this is a local matter and the party is still pro-free speech. But Lee Anderson, who is 25% of the Reform parliamentary party, technically speaking, 1 in 4, has joined the boycott of the Post. He is, of course, the MP for Ashfield in Nottinghamshire, so maybe wanting to show some solidarity with his Reform colleagues.
So, altogether, whether it's looking at how uncomfortable they seem to be with the scrutiny of the press when it comes to how they actually perform, or whether it's just the difficulties within the party itself on agreeing on policy, I suppose it does raise questions about whether, they're clearly very good at campaigning. Would they be any good at governing?
Reform certainly has the wind in its sails. It's been leading in every single opinion poll since the start of May. So whisper it quietly, but we should take seriously the prospect that Reform could at least stand a chance of helping form the next government, whether that's in coalition with one party or another, or maybe being able to stand on its own 2 feet. Previously, those types of swings would have been thought of as unimaginable. But these days, voter volatility is such that we can move from Boris Johnson getting a massive majority in 2019 to Keir Starmer getting an even bigger one in 2024. And that means that the prospect of a Reform government should be taken seriously, which means that they are going to have to face some serious scrutiny as well about their policies, particularly their economic plans. The party has been talking about plans to raise the income tax threshold, for example, from the current level of about £12,500 to £20,000. The Institute for Fiscal Studies estimated that would cost about £50 to £80 billion a year. And Reform's also been talking about spending up to £40 billion more on health, defence and tackling crime. The answers we've had for this are that this lavish expenditure can be funded by dropping commitments to net zero and scrapping diversity, equity and inclusion in gender and abolishing asylum hotels. But I think it is hard to see how those numbers add up. And Reform still faces a significant credibility gap, which voters will feel and be more mindful of the closer we get to the next election.
Do you really think so? Because, as you said, we as journalists, we analyse the policy, we think through the implications, we look at the loopholes, we try to work out if it would work. Do you think that's where the electorate is at the moment? Because there seems to be so much momentum behind Reform.
I think historically, if you look back at previous election cycles, it's not unusual for opposition parties to be riding high in the opinion polls. It probably is unusual for the governing party to have had its support collapse so quickly, and it certainly is unusual for the opposition party to be ahead in the opinion polls, not to be one of the main two, either Labour or the Conservatives. So there are all sorts of unknowns, and we are in unprecedented territory, but I think Reform still does have a long way to go to prove that it's ready.
That was Aubrey Allegretti, Chief Political Correspondent at The Times. The producers today were Olivia Case and Maeve Gallagher. The executive producer was Kate Lamble. Sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto. If you can, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll be back with more this weekend.